Say hello. Today we are going to walk through a story that genuinely rewrites what you thought you knew about ancient Egypt. Because somewhere in the dusty highlands of eastern Sudan, tucked between the Red Sea and the Nile, there is a group of about 2 million people who have been carrying a secret for millennia. They didn't build pyramids. They didn't leave hieroglyphs on temple walls. But when scientists finally cracked open their DNA, the results landed like a thunderclap in the world of archaeology. The Beja people might not just be related to the ancient Egyptians. They might be the closest thing we have to living pharaohs. Not metaphorically, genetically. The lab coats have the receipts. I want you to imagine something before we dive in. Picture the Egypt you know from textbooks. The gold masks, the linen wraps, the colossal statues staring out across the desert. Now ask yourself a question that has haunted historians for 2 centuries. Who were those people, really? And where did they go? For decades, the assumption was that modern Egyptians, the folks living in Cairo and Alexandria and Luxor today, are the direct descendants of the pyramid builders. It makes intuitive sense. Same land, same river, same sun. But genetics doesn't care about intuition. And when researchers started pulling DNA from mummies that had been silent for 4,000 years, the story cracked open. A group of nomadic herders, warriors so fierce that the Roman Empire couldn't subdue them, turned out to be the ones holding the genetic thread unbroken. This is the 7-step breakdown of how that discovery happened and what it means for you. 1. The people Rome couldn't beat. Let's start where all good ancient stories start, with the Romans losing their minds. The year is 297 of the Common Era. The Roman Emperor Diocletian is sitting in his palace trying to manage an empire that stretches from Britain to Persia, and there is one tiny patch of desert on the southern frontier that is driving him absolutely insane. He issues a dispatch. We still have records of this. He describes a people called the Blemmyes. His words basically boil down to, "We cannot conquer these people because they simply retreat into the desert and disappear." Imagine the frustration. You are the most powerful military machine on planet Earth. Your legions have crushed everyone from Gaulish chieftains to Parthian cavalry. And yet here is this group of lean, tall warriors who ride camels into the Red Sea hills and simply vanish into a landscape that would kill a legionary in 2 days. You cannot pin them down. You cannot make them submit. Diocletian eventually gave up and just paid them a bribe, essentially a protection tax, to stop raiding Roman Egypt. He actually ceded land to them. Rome didn't do that. But they did it for the Blemmyes. Now who were these Blemmyes? Roman and Byzantine sources described them in vivid, sometimes mythical terms. Later medieval legends twisted the name into a race of headless monsters with faces in their chests. That's not true, obviously. That's just what happens when stories travel 1,000 miles. But the real Blemmyes were, by broad scholarly consensus, the direct ancestors of the Beja people we are talking about today. The name Beja doesn't appear until later Arabic sources, but the continuity is rock solid. The Blemmyes controlled the eastern desert, the gold mines, and the trade routes between the Nile and the Red Sea. They spoke a language utterly alien to Greek, Latin, and Egyptian. And they practiced a form of nomadic pastoralism that allowed them to survive in environments that looked like the surface of Mars. Fast forward to the 10th century. The Arab geographer Ibn Hawqal writes about these same deserts in 977 CE. He describes the Beja as a people of immense physical stature, fierce independence, and a language that no outsider can pronounce. 170 years later, the great cartographer al-Idrisi, writing in Sicily in 1154, maps their territory and calls them the Beja, noting that they are Muslims now, but still untamed, still separate, still themselves. This is the first thing you need to understand about the Beja. For at least 1,700 years, probably much longer, they have been doing one thing with remarkable consistency: avoiding assimilation. Not out of hostility, but out of a deep, structural, geographic isolation. They lived where nobody else wanted to live. And that isolation, that stubborn refusal to be absorbed, is the entire reason their genes tell a story that nobody else's can. 2. The language that refused to die. Before we get to the DNA, which is the main event, we have to talk about language, because language often leaves fossils that genetics later confirms. The Beja speak a language called, sensibly enough, Beja. It is a Cushitic language. That places it in the broader Afro-Asiatic family, which is a huge supergroup that includes Arabic, Hebrew, Amharic, Somali, and, critically, Ancient Egyptian. Now, ancient Egyptian is a separate branch of Afro-Asiatic entirely. It's not Cushitic, it's its own extinct limb on the language tree, with Coptic as its last surviving liturgical echo. But the fact that Beja sits on a neighboring branch is not a coincidence. Cushitic languages are very old in Northeast Africa. Very, very old. They predate the spread of Semitic languages like Arabic by thousands of years. So when you hear a Beja speaker today producing sounds that feel utterly foreign to Arabic, you are hearing a linguistic lineage that was already ancient when the first pharaoh unified the two lands in 3100 BCE. This is not a language that arrived with a recent migration. This is a language that has been sitting in the same region, evolving on its own, while empires rose and fell around it. The linguistic isolation matches the geographic isolation, and that is almost always a neon sign pointing to a deep, unbroken genetic story. 3. The back migration before there was a migration. Alright, let's get into the lab. This is where it gets genuinely mind-bending. In 2014, a team led by Jason Hodgson published a paper in PLOS Genetics titled Early Back to Africa Migration into the Horn of Africa. This paper introduced a concept that upended the standard model of human migration. The standard model, which you probably learned in school, goes like this. Modern humans evolved in Africa, a small group left about 60,000 years ago, and those leavers populated the entire rest of the planet. That's the Out of Africa event. Clean, simple. But Hodgson and colleagues found something that didn't fit. They identified a genetic component in East African populations, which they labeled the Ethio-Somali component, that came from a much earlier event. This wasn't the big exit. This was an early return wave. A back migration from the Middle East or Levant region into Africa that happened between 35,000 and 25,000 years ago. Let that number sink in. That is deep into the Paleolithic. That is before the last ice age maximum. That is before agriculture, before pottery, before villages. That is people walking back into the African continent when the map of humanity was still being drawn in charcoal and ochre. The Beja people carry this Ethio-Somali component at a very high percentage. Roughly 30 to 40% of their entire genome descends from this ancient back migration. This means the Beja are not a simple mix of African and Arab. They are a living snapshot of a prehistoric population movement that predates all recorded history. The key here is that this wave didn't just hit the Beja and stop, it becomes part of the foundational ancestry of the entire region. And the Beja, through their isolation, preserved the signal in high concentration, while other populations diluted it with later arrivals. 4. The Y chromosome that ties it all together. If you want to trace paternal lineages, you follow the Y chromosome. It passes from father to son with very little change across generations, leaving a breadcrumb trail of mutations that geneticists can map like a family tree. In 2013, a team led by Alessio Boattini published a paper examining precisely these markers in the Beja and related populations. The title gives the game away. Y chromosomal evidence supports a shared Bronze Age origin of the Beja. Now, Boattini's team found a few dominant lineages in Beja men. The biggest one, representing about 30% of their Y chromosomes, is a haplogroup called T1A-M70. This is a rare lineage globally, but it pops up in very specific places. You find it in Neolithic farmers from the Levant. We are talking skeletons from sites dating to around 10,000 BCE. You find it in ancient samples from the Fertile Crescent. You find it in lower frequencies in parts of East Africa. And you find it concentrated in the Beja at levels that are almost unmatched anywhere else. T1A is one of the oldest continuously traceable lineages in the world. It is not the most famous. E1B1B, another lineage common in the Beja, gets more attention because it covers most of Africa and parts of Europe. J1C3, also present, connects to the broader Semitic-speaking world. But T1A is the smoking gun for a very ancient, very specific connection to the same population that was living in the Levant when the first stones of the first proto-cities were being laid. This is not a recent Arab migration. The Arab expansions out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century CE spread the J1 haplogroup widely across North Africa. The Beja have some J1, sure, but the star of the show, the core paternal signal, is T1A. This suggests a Bronze Age, or even earlier, link between the ancestors of the Beja and the Eastern Mediterranean world. And this link predates the existence of Egypt as a unified state, predates the pyramids. This means the genetic substrate that would become Pharaonic Egypt was already flowing through the veins of the people living between the Nile and the Red Sea before the first stone of the first mastaba tomb was ever cut. 5. The mummy DNA bombshell. Now we arrive at the study that set the internet on fire. 2017, Nature Communications. A German team led by Verena Schuenemann publishes Ancient Egyptian Mummy Genomes Suggest an Increase of Sub-Saharan African Ancestry in Post-Roman Periods. This paper was a landmark because it was the first time scientists had successfully extracted and sequenced whole genomes from Egyptian mummies. The dry heat, the embalming chemicals, the age, all of these make ancient DNA from Egyptian mummies exceptionally difficult to recover. But Schuenemann's team managed it. They took samples from mummies spanning roughly 1,500 years, from the Middle Kingdom around 2000 BCE down to the Roman period. And the results triggered a lot of conversations. The Middle Kingdom mummies, that is the high classical age of Pharaonic Egypt, showed a genetic profile that clustered very strongly with ancient and modern populations from the Near East and the Levant. Sub-Saharan African ancestry in those mummies was notably low compared to modern Egyptians. Then the team looked at modern Egyptians and found something striking. Around 15 to 20% of modern Egyptian DNA traces to sub-Saharan African populations. But this component arrived after 500 CE. The post-Roman, late Antique, and Islamic periods brought significant gene flow from sub-Saharan Africa and from the Arabian Peninsula into the Nile Valley. This means the genetic profile of modern Egyptians is not identical to the genetic profile of the ancient Egyptians who built the Middle Kingdom pyramids. That's not a value judgment, it's just chronological genetics. Populations change. But here's the twist that directly involves the Beja. When Schuenemann's team and subsequent researchers compared the ancient Egyptian mummy DNA to living populations in the region, the Beja markers showed a closer genetic affinity to those Middle Kingdom mummies than modern Egyptians do. Let me phrase that carefully because it is the core of everything. Genetically, the Beja are a closer match to the mummies of the pharaohs than the people currently living in Cairo. The Beja, tucked away in their eastern desert, never received the post-500 CE sub-Saharan gene flow that reshaped the Egyptian genetic landscape to the degree that the Nile Valley populations did. They also largely escaped the massive Arabian genetic input that came with the Islamic conquests. The Beja did convert to Islam, they did have cultural contact, but their gene pool remained remarkably buffered. The desert acted as a genetic time capsule. So the Beja today carry a genetic signature that looks more like the actual ancient Egyptians from 4,000 years ago. That phrasing, living descendants of the ancient Egyptians, which sounds like hyperbolic clickbait, is unfortunately for the skeptics, literally what the genetic data suggests. They are not the only descendants. Modern Egyptians and many other groups carry that ancestry too. But the Beja preserve the highest proportional continuity with the pre-dynastic, Old Kingdom, and Middle Kingdom Pharaonic genetic profile. They are a living window into the faces that looked upon the Sphinx when its nose was still intact. 6. What they actually look like and why that matters. Describing physical appearance from genetics is a minefield, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But we can stick to well-documented anthropological observations and the ancient descriptions themselves. The Beja are often described as tall, very lean, with dark brown skin and strong, prominent facial features. High cheekbones, narrow faces, distinctively shaped noses. The Roman descriptions of the Blemmyes emphasize their tall stature and their physical endurance. The medieval Arab geographers say similar things. These features align broadly with what we call the Cushitic physical type, shared across much of the Horn of Africa in populations like Somalis, Afars, and Oromos, though each group has its own variation. Now, the ancient Egyptian art is stylized. It followed rigid representational canons for 2,000 years. You cannot just hold up a photo of a Beja man today and say, that's exactly what Ramses looked like. But the art does depict a range of skin tones and facial structures. The typical Egyptian self-depiction used a reddish-brown for men and a lighter ochre for women, a convention that seems to have been symbolic as much as observational. What the Beja evidence does is it grounds the debate about ancient Egyptian appearance in actual data. The genetic profile of the pre-Roman mummies was a Northeast African and Near Eastern amalgam. The Beja embody that amalgam today, in the flesh, breathing. They are not a lost white tribe or an isolated African tribe in the simplistic racial binaries that plague internet discourse. They are exactly what the DNA says, a Northeast African people with deep Paleolithic roots on the continent, a significant layer of very ancient Levantine back migration, and a remarkable degree of continuity across millennia. They blur the boundaries that modern people want to impose on the ancient world. And that blurring is more truthful to the complexity of the Nile Valley than any simplistic narrative. 7. The big reveal. The unbroken thread and why it includes you. We have walked through the Roman rage, the linguistic fossils, the Paleolithic return wave, the Neolithic Y chromosomes, and the mummy genomes that flip the script. Here is the final item on the list, and it's the one that lingers after the video ends. The Beja are not a museum exhibit. They are not a lost tribe waiting to be discovered. They know exactly who they are. They have a living culture, a modern identity, political struggles, a diaspora, and a future. What the DNA does is simply confirm what their own oral traditions and lifeways have always insisted. We have been here, in this desert, since before the world outside had names for us. The genetic data says that the Beja avoided the major demographic turnovers that reshaped the populations around them. While the Nile Valley absorbed Greeks, Romans, Nubians, Arabs, Turks, and sub-Saharan migrants, the Beja stayed in their hills, marrying within their clans, speaking their ancient tongue, and maintaining a genetic continuity that stretches back beyond the Bronze Age, beyond the Neolithic, into a time when the Sahara was green and the pyramids were not yet a dream. This is not about claiming that the Beja are the exclusive heirs to ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt was a civilization built by a diverse population, and its genetic legacy radiates outward into dozens of modern groups. But the Beja represent the most unbroken, the most continuous thread. They are the genetic reference point that puts the pharaonic genome back on the map of living humanity. When you look at a Beja person today, you are looking into a face that carries, with less dilution than almost any other, the visage of the ancient world's most iconic civilization. Think about what that means for a moment. There is a tendency in archaeology to treat ancient peoples as vanished, as mysteries, as ghosts whose bloodlines have evaporated into the soil. The Beja shatter that illusion. They are the reminder that history does not simply end. It flows. It recedes into deserts. It whispers in languages that empires failed to erase. The Romans couldn't do it. The caliphates couldn't do it. The modern nation-states with their borders and their nationalisms haven't done it. The thread held. The same genetic markers that were placed into the earth at Jebel Sahaba and along the Nile in pre-dynastic times are walking around under the Sudanese sun right now, carrying water, herding camels, speaking words that would be partially recognizable to their ancestors 40,000 years removed. You and I, all of us watching, are part of this same tangled story. Your own genome, whatever it is, contains back migrations and ancient admixtures and moments of isolation. The Beja just happened to be the ones who preserved one of the most consequential chapters in a form that scientists could finally read. They are not a relic. They are a living argument against historical erasure. The next time you see a golden mask in a museum, remember that the face behind it was not an abstraction. It had a genetic signature, and that signature is not extinct. It's just been living quietly in the eastern desert, waiting for the rest of us to catch up. And that's the complete list. If you found this journey worth taking, subscribe. There are more stories like this waiting. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Thanks for staying until the very end. Goodbye for now.